Welcome to Unlocking the Bible, Lesson 4. Before we start with the lesson today, let's do a few quick review questions of the last 3 lessons. First question, how did Satan tempt Eve? We learned in Lesson 1 that Satan tempted Eve through deception. He tempted Eve through a lie and the 3 elements of sin found in 1 John 2 and 16. These 3 elements of sin are the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. Second question, why did Cain kill Abel? This was in Lesson 2. We learned that rebellious Cain refused God's mercy and he allowed sin to control him. And as a result, he killed Abel. The third question, why did God start circumcision? It was the physical sign of man's acceptance of God's covenant. That's why God started circumcision. Question 4, why did Lot's wife die? Lot's wife died, if you remember from the story. She looked back on the city of Sodom and Gomorrah, even when the angels told her not to. And when she did, she turned into a pillar of salt. Her looking back and her disobedience towards the words that the angels said showed that she loved the world more than God. And that's why Lot's wife died. Question 5. What character traits made it easy for Joseph to overcome his difficult past? If you remember the life of Joseph, he went through quite a hard time. But it was forgiveness, trust in God, that kept Joseph on the right track. And he continually refused sin. This was what helped Joseph to overcome his difficult past. So in the last lesson, we ended with the Hebrew children living in Egypt. They found favor in the sight of Pharaoh because of Joseph. And everything was great until Joseph and the Pharaoh died. And then the Bible says in Exodus 1 and 8 that there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And this is when the real trouble for the children of Israel really began. This new Pharaoh was threatened by the Hebrew children, and he was afraid that they would grow so big in number that they would overthrow Egypt. So he decided to devise a plan. Let's read Exodus chapter 1, verses 10 to 14. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And it happened in the event of war that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh's supply cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, and they were in dread of the children of Israel. So the Egyptian male the children of Israel served with rigor, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar and brick and in all manner of service in the field. All their service in which they made them serve was with rigor. Pharaoh put taskmasters over them and drove them to hard labor, and he hopes that this will stop the Hebrew children from growing. But the reverse happened. These verses tell us that the more that they were afflicted, the more they multiplied and grew. And we see the same thing happening in the New Testament when the church was persecuted. Many Christians died during that time, but it was during that time that Christianity really grew. God has a purpose for every hardship in our lives. No matter how hard our circumstances are, God can make us grow stronger and better. When setting taskmasters over them did not work, Pharaoh devised a plan to kill the male babies. Let's read Exodus chapter 1, 16 to 17. And he said, when you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stools, if it is a son, then you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive. The Hebrew midwives feared God. They saved the male children alive. As a result, Pharaoh ordered that the male children be thrown into the river. Let's read Exodus chapter 1, verse 22. So Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. The Hebrew children had lived in Egypt for many, many years after Joseph. Generations had existed in Egypt, and all these families had settled down. They had maybe had their own shops and own businesses. As the children went to school, they got married, and they had families, and they lived their lives in Egypt. They were very settled and very comfortable. And things seemed good to the Hebrew children. But it was during this time of good things that they forgot the promises of God. God had a promised land for the children of Israel, and this promised land was not Egypt. This promised land was a land to be flowing with milk and honey. This land was a land that they could call their own. And this place was better than Egypt. But all the Hebrew children were so comfortable where they were, they would rather stay in the good than pursue the best that God had for them. And in order for God to fulfill His promises to the children of Israel, He allowed adversities to come into their lives so that they would want to move out of Egypt. Where was God wanting them to move to? Was it a better or a worse place? It was a better place. God wanted to move them with a land flowing with milk and honey. And similarly in our lives, God will often allow adversity in our lives to move us into a better place. We just don't see it yet. But if we trust God, we will see His purpose in time. This brings us to our key number 1. God uses all things, good and bad, to bless us.